Are you curious about where you stand in the UK's wealth landscape? In this video, we'll explore how your wealth compares to others, but also what it means for your investment strategy. We'll also look at how wealth inequality affects your investment opportunities, and also what steps you can take to build wealth more effectively. This video is sponsored by Wise, and if you use the link in the description, you'll get a free first transfer of up to £500 or a free card if you're a new Wise customer. Let's start with a big picture for UK wealth. Throughout this video, we'll be talking about deciles. So if you imagine you take all of the households in the UK and line them up according to wealth. So for example, here you've got the lowest wealth on the left-hand side, and you've got the highest wealth on the right-hand side. The household which is directly in the middle is the one for which 50% of households have greater wealth and 50% have lower wealth. And the median, which is what that is, has a wealth of £294,000. So you can think of that as the typical wealth of a UK household. And this is based on data from the ONS as of the end of 2023. What we can also do is to decompose that wealth into its components. And the Office for National Statistics uses 4 categories. You can see that the largest category is net property wealth. The word net simply means that you look at the value of the house and subtract the value of any loans or mortgages used to pay for the house. The second largest category is pension wealth, and that makes up a little bit less than the property wealth. So property is 117,000 and private pension wealth is 103. Then we get to net financial wealth, and again the word net here means that you look at the assets and subtract the liabilities. The assets would be things like bank accounts, cash in those bank accounts, ISAs, any kind of investments excluding pensions, and then the liabilities would be things like overdrafts, student loans or other types of loan. Now that just makes up 14% of the median household's wealth, and then the smallest category is physical wealth. So these are the valuable things you own in your house, which in theory you could sell. So that could be your car, it could be jewelry, it could be furniture. But those 2 largest categories, which is your pension and your house, typically make up the vast bulk of wealth in the UK. Now it's always interesting to compare the UK with other countries because we think of ourselves as a wealthy country, and in fact that is what we are. If you look at the wealth per person instead of per household, this comparison, which was done by UBS, shows that the UK ranks pretty highly. But a really important distinction here is between the mean, which is the average, and the median. Now the mean or the average is very much driven by outliers. So if we include millionaires and billionaires, the US certainly gets pushed up the ranks, and that's what you get with an average. But if you exclude those billionaires and just look at the median, which is very insensitive to those outliers, the US ranks much lower. And also the UK ranks much higher. It's actually in that list of countries with the greatest personal wealth. If we dig into the actual report from UBS, you can see in this table the most up-to-date data. And when we look at mean or average wealth, which is sensitive to those outliers, the billionaires, the UK ranks number 13. Whereas if we look at the median, the UK gets bumped up to number 8. So if you do live in the UK, well, you've got an instant leg up because we are a wealthy country relative to other countries. Now we're going to dig into those categories of wealth in the UK, but also strategies you can use to bump up your wealth long term. But before we do that, let me mention Wise, who's the sponsor of today's video. I first came across Wise when I transferred some money to a colleague in India, and I was amazed by how much better their rates were, Wise's, than other methods of sending money. As an individual or a business, you may have to pay and receive foreign currency, whether that's for work, investments, or retirement income. The larger and more frequent the transfers, the greater your savings. And this becomes especially important if you're dealing with pensions, investments, or overseas income. For example, many UK investors draw pensions from abroad, perhaps a US 401k, an EU-based pension scheme, or even a private retirement account held in another currency. Wise gives you local account details in 9 currencies, including the dollar, euro, Aussie dollar, Canadian dollar, and sterling, of course. So your pension provider can pay you just like they would a domestic customer. Once received, you can convert the money to pounds using Wise's mid-market exchange rate without the typical hidden bank fees. Likewise, if you sell foreign shares or funds, say you've invested in US listed ETFs or stocks denominated in dollars, you'll typically be paid in that foreign currency. Or you could be earning dividend income in another currency. Converting that income through a traditional broker or bank can incur poor rates and fees. With Wise, you can route the sale proceeds to your Wise US dollar account and then convert to sterling or any other currency you use with minimal friction and a clear fee up front. The same applies if you're receiving rental income from an overseas property or if you're a business owner paid by clients in another country. Wise makes these types of cross-border transfers efficient, low cost and transparent. On top of that, Wise offers the ability to earn a variable rate of interest on balances in 3 major currencies. These returns come from safe, short-duration government bonds and also reflect current central bank interest rates in sterling, US dollars and euros. While not guaranteed, it's a practical way to earn some yield on your cash without locking it away. Use the link in the description for a fee-free transfer of up to £500 or to claim a free Wise card exclusively for PensionCraft viewers. The reality in the UK is that there's a great deal of wealth inequality. So let's look at income deciles here. So here we're looking at household income added up for all of the household members. And again, we're going to rank households from the poorest households on the far left to the richest on the far right. And then on the y-axis, what you can see is the median household wealth in those income bands. Of course, as we increase income, what you see is a gradual increase in household wealth. But if you look at the top decile, you can see that the typical wealth is a little bit short of £1 million. Now that's about 10 times what you'd get in the lowest income decile. So a vast disparity between the richest households and the poorest. What's also fascinating is breaking down those deciles according to the wealth components we've seen already. But before we do that, let's look at the relative sizes of wealth in the different categories. So now we are breaking down by wealth decile, and what we're also showing here is the top 1% as well as the top decile. So that's on the far right of the graph. Now it turns out that the top 1% of the wealth distribution owns about 10% of the total wealth in the UK. And that's about equal to the total wealth in the bottom 50% of the distribution. So there's a very large proportion of the wealth being held by the very wealthiest, and the bottom 50% holds about as much as that top 1%. Now what I've done here is I've taken that graph and I've just looked at the components as percentages rather than pound amounts. And that's just to highlight the composition of wealth according to the wealth decile. Now what's really remarkable here is the huge difference in composition according to whether households are wealthy or poor. So for the poorest households, you can see that physical wealth makes up 100% of their overall wealth. That's because they've got no property wealth, they must be renting, they also have no financial wealth or private pension wealth. Fortunately, when you get to the third decile, you do start to get pensions becoming much more important. And I suspect that's largely because of auto-enrolment, as we'll see later. That's been a very important change in the UK, and a positive one. When we get to the fourth decile, you can see that property suddenly kicks in and becomes a very important component, and that stays important throughout the rest of the wealth deciles. But what really marks out the top wealth deciles is the financial wealth of those households. So that could be money in building society accounts or bank deposits, it could be stocks and shares ISAs or cash ISAs, or it could be things like premium bonds. But those kind of investments really mark out the top most wealthy households in the UK. We can also look at the geographic distribution of wealth in the UK, and it's very clear there's a north-south divide here. So the median wealth in the richest region is the southeast, where it's around £490,000. The east of England is around 400,000, and if we look at the southwest, 348,000. But compare that with the poorest region in the UK, and that'll be the northeast, where the median household wealth is around 180,000, a vast difference geographically. Now, if you go further north, the wealth does pick up a bit, so median household wealth there is around 240,000. And if we look at the age of the head of each household in the UK, we can also break down wealth according to the age of that head of household. Now, it's not completely surprising that older households tend to have more wealth. They've been saving for longer, they've probably been investing in property for longer, so they've had a greater time on this planet to accumulate wealth. So that builds up from almost nothing for 16 to 24-year-olds to peak at around 55 to 74, and then it starts to fall as people deplete their assets in retirement. Now, we saw that property was the most important category, so let's dig into that data now. Now, what you can see is that for areas like London with very high property prices, property wealth made up 51% of total household wealth, and this was in March of 2022. In contrast, if you look at the North East and Scotland, pension wealth made up a larger proportion of total wealth, the largest proportion in fact. And that simply reflects lower house prices and lower total median wealth in those regions. Now, I have made videos about the UK housing market where I looked at how prices increased in the past. And the really big jumps in prices happened in the 90s and early 2000s. Now, it's no coincidence that large house price increases tend to happen when interest rates are low. During these periods, you can borrow more and the debt servicing costs are lower. Now, after the global financial crisis, interest rates were very close to zero, certainly for the central bank policy rates. And if we look at mortgage rates here, you can see that they were low too. So during a period of almost a decade, you could have borrowed at less than 2% for a 90% loan to value and fixed for a 2-year period. Compare that with today, and you'll typically be looking at around 5% for the same mortgage. So that clearly has a chilling effect on house prices. And people who got into the housing market and fixed their mortgage when rates were very low benefited greatly from being able to do that. So I think there's a justifiable anger on behalf of young people in the UK because they feel that they're not going to have this boost which previous generations got, primarily low interest rates, but also having more affordable housing. Nationwide publishes quite detailed regional data on how affordable houses are, and this is purely for first-time buyers. So what they do is they compare the mortgage servicing cost, maybe that's your monthly mortgage payment, relative to people's wages. Here you can see the long-term average of that price to income ratio in grey, compared with the latest data in the second quarter of 2025. Notice how in almost all cases, the affordability is now lower. The price to income ratio is higher. That's particularly true in the most expensive regions like London. Now, this comes at the same time that rents are going up very sharply at over 7% a year. So for first-time buyers, they're in a really difficult position where you can't easily save for a deposit because you have to pay expensive rent, and houses are just very unaffordable except for a few regions. Now, it's always nice to think that you can address these wealth gap imbalances, but I think in the case of young people, it's going to be very difficult to address this wealth gap when it comes to property. Now let's consider the pension wealth gap, because that's also a big component of UK wealth. Now clearly, if you're just starting out in your career, you won't have much pension wealth at all, because you won't have had much time to save, and those investments won't have had much time to compound. But if you did want to compare the size of your pension with other people of the same age, this distribution will allow you to do that. Now it has two sets of bars. The yellow ones are for people with pension wealth, so these are people with a pension, and the purple bars are for everyone. And the profile is much as you'd expect. It builds up, it peaks at around 65 to 74, and then as people draw down on their pension, the size of that wealth diminishes. And the peak pension wealth, I think, is surprisingly low. It's £150,000. And that's a median, of course. That's a typical value. There'd be huge variation around that. What's particularly worrying for the UK is the gender gap when it comes to pension wealth. Now, the actual name from this report for the gender pay gap is almost incomprehensible, which is why it's shortened to gender pay gap. It's defined as the gap between male and female uncrystallized non-zero median pension wealth around normal minimum pension age. So that's a bit of a mouthful. We'll just call it the gender pay gap. But what's really surprising is its magnitude. That's a 35% gap. Now we get an insight into where it comes from if we dig into the age variation of that wage gap. It's smallest for people who are youngest, age 35 to 39, it's only 10% there. And then it increases to 47% for people age 45 to 49. And then it decreases again in later years of working life. Now that pattern's very similar to the trajectory you'd expect if you look at the gender pay gap, and of course these two things are related. If women are paid less, particularly in the middle of their career when men tend to reach their peak earning potential, well, it's not surprising that women would be able to save less because of that pay gap. And that's going to have repercussions for the rest of their life. Now, the good news is that this difference, the gender pay gap, but also the pension gap, is decreasing over time, but it's decreasing very slowly. But it's not all bad news. I think one of the greatest developments, which I mentioned earlier, is auto-enrolment in the UK. Here you can see the effect of auto-enrolment on the proportion of employees with workplace pensions. Notice how it very rapidly increases the proportion of people with those pensions. So this is going to redress a lot of the imbalances that we see between people who have saved into a pension, particularly early on. That's when you get the greatest compounding, and those who haven't, which are now a much smaller proportion of the overall population. Finally, let's talk about financial assets, which is something that's very close to my own heart. If we look at a measure of inequality and look at the different components of UK wealth, you can see that the component which has the greatest inequality is this net financial wealth. We also saw that when we looked at the deciles. You'll remember that financial wealth is primarily the preserve of the wealthiest households. So financial wealth, pension wealth, those are very unequal. Now I think that education has a huge part to play to reduce the size of that gap. And I think the reason for that is people simply don't know the benefits of compounding over a long period of time. If they did, they wouldn't be stuffing money into cash ISAs. And yet that's exactly what we see is happening in the UK. If we look at ISA subscriptions, which is the number of new ISAs being opened by people, and we look at that broken down year by year, but also by ISA type, notice the purple bars, which are the cash ISAs, are completely dominant. For example, in the 22-23 year band, just under 8 million cash ISAs were opened versus just under 4 million stocks and shares ISAs. Now the returns you're going to get for a stocks and shares ISA long term, if you have equity in it, will tend to be much larger and benefit you much more. And yet many people are still opting for the safety of a cash ISA. And if there's one thing I'd like everyone in the UK to know by heart, it's this table. And just two numbers on that table. One of them is a real return that you'd get from investing in stocks, and the other is the real return you'd get from investing in cash. Now the difference between those two is called cash drag, and it amounts to a huge 4 to 6% on average per year over the last 120 years. So the cost of safety is absolutely huge. It's really going to reduce your long-term return. Of course, if you invest in stocks, it's a roller coaster. Prices go up and down, they fluctuate hugely day to day and year to year. But over the long term, it really has paid off. And certainly speaking to wealthier people, which I do through PensionCraft, I know that these people are aware of this difference in return. If everyone was aware of it, then I think we could redress some of this difference in overall wealth when it comes to financial wealth. Now, of course, I know what you're thinking. People with lower incomes have less to save and they'll benefit less than wealthy people. That's obviously true. But it still would benefit people hugely, particularly early on in life, if they could squirrel some money away in a stocks and shares ISA, ideally to have a reasonable equity allocation in that, because that'll be a huge benefit to them much later in life. So let's draw this together into some conclusions for how you can maximize your wealth. Firstly, I'd say it's really important to assess your wealth, and that's so that you can fix it. If you have got a shortfall in your pension or in your savings, then it's really important to know that early on when you can still do something about it. But what I would say is assess, but don't obsess. If you become obsessed with wealth, then I think it's unhealthy. Set reasonable goals for yourself, think about what makes you happy, and that might not always be to do with money. Wealth is there to enable you to achieve the things which you want in life. And that's not always about Lamborghinis and fancy jewellery. Personally, I find that the really simple things in life are what I enjoy most, like walking my dog Teddy or spending time with friends and family. And if you're young, don't get too worried about not being particularly wealthy. As we saw, that's completely normal. That doesn't mean you shouldn't plan to have greater wealth in future, far from it. But just don't beat yourself up because you haven't got ahead of the pack early on. Secondly, I think it's really important to understand asset allocation. How much have you got in stocks, how much in bonds, how much in cash, how much in property, and how will that affect your future returns? Understanding those long-term returns that we saw in that table is very important. And then finally, make the most of our incredibly generous tax wrapper accounts in the UK. That's the individual savings account and the SIP, because those allow you to keep more of your long-term gains. Other countries don't have such generous schemes, so why not make the best of it? That's another big difference that you see if you look at usage of those accounts. Wealthier people tend to use them much more, partly because they've got more money to invest in them, but also because I think they're better educated about using them. So I hope that's helped you see where you sit in the UK wealth landscape. Don't get too obsessed about it, but use it to your benefit and maybe adjust your strategy to achieve greater wealth down the line. Now don't forget the offer from the sponsor of today's video, which is Wise. You can use the link in the description for a fee-free transfer of up to £500, or you could claim a free Wise card. And, as always, thank you for listening.